When diving into extensive literature on medieval weapons and armor, one might experience a bit of a disconnect. Texts about ranged weapons like bows often highlight the astounding effectiveness of arrows against any kind of armor. Meanwhile, works focused on medieval armor tend to conclude that it was nearly impenetrable. Both sides cite written sources, which researchers often believe to be somewhat exaggerated. So, who's actually right? Let's figure it out. First, we need to clarify what we mean by medieval armor, specifically 15th century plate armor with a breastplate roughly 2 millimeters thick. And opposing it, we'll consider the simple yet powerful English longbow of the same period. The armor's resistance depended on several factors, with one of the most important being the quality of the metal. The hardness of 15th century armor ranged from 20 to 50 on the Rockwell scale. The strongest samples were comparable to mid-quality modern tool steel. Another crucial factor was the type of arrowhead used. The armor-piercing arrowhead had greater penetration but caused less damage, and was relatively easy to remove from a wound. Another critical factor was the angle at which the arrow struck the armor. The best-case scenario was a direct hit at a right angle. It's also important to remember that piercing armor and actually wounding the target are two different things. Beneath the breastplate, there was padding or an underarmor layer, and to inflict significant damage, the arrow had to go several centimeters into the body after getting through that layer. An arrow fired from an English longbow with a draw weight of 50 kilograms could penetrate a breastplate 1 to 1.2 millimeters thick from 25 meters and embed itself about 1 centimeter into the body. But a high-quality 2 millimeter thick breastplate was more than the longbow could handle. Historian Nicole, in his study of the 100 Years' War, wrote that to protect themselves from arrows, knights simply had to tilt their heads, causing arrows to bounce harmlessly off their helmets and shoulder armor. In most 14th century battles, contemporary accounts agree that shooting at knights in plate armor was largely ineffective. However, not everyone could afford such armor. English archers fired volleys of arrows that often struck less protected areas like thighs or inflicted serious injuries to horses. Historian John Keegan even argued that the English longbow was primarily a weapon against horses. To preempt the question about the 100 Years' War where English archers made their mark, it's worth noting that heavily armored cavalry made up only about 2% of the French forces. In conclusion, a knight in high-quality plate armor generally had little to fear from arrows. However, there was always a small chance of being hit in weak spots that armor couldn't cover. A solid suit of armor was a medieval miracle, blocking swords, arrows, and even those early firearms. The bad news? It was the Bentley of battle gear, reserved for the elite. Most soldiers were left with bargain bin protection. But hey, subscribing is the one advantage we can all afford.